Walk through London today, and everything looks polished. Glass towers, luxury shops, tourists everywhere, red buses, black cabs. Beautiful city, powerful city. But look down. Beneath your feet lies 2,000 years of blood, betrayal, and suffering. Every cobblestone has a story. Most of them are terrifying. This isn't the history they teach in school. This is the dark side. The executions, the plagues, the torture chambers, the serial killers, the riots, the cover-ups. The London that powerful people wanted you to forget. The London that was built not just on ambition and trade, but on fear, violence, and the bones of people nobody remembers. You're about to descend into 2,000 years of darkness. Sit back, and don't say I didn't warn you. The year is 43 AD. 4 Roman legions land on the Kent coast and push inland. They need a river crossing. They find one at the Thames, the lowest point before the river widens into an estuary. Within a decade, Londinium is alive. Merchants, soldiers, traders from across the empire. Seems like a success story. But this city wasn't born in peace. It was born in conquest. And within 17 years, it would drown in blood. Queen Boudicca of the Iceni tribe had watched the Romans humiliate her family, seize her land, and destroy her people. She had every reason to burn the world down, and she did. Her army marched on Londinium with one purpose: total destruction. No mercy, no prisoners. Historians estimate 70,000 people were slaughtered. Not just Romans, everyone. The city was burned to ash so completely that archaeologists today can still find that layer of red destruction buried beneath modern London. You walk over it every day without knowing. The Romans rebuilt, bigger, stronger, more brutal. They constructed a massive wall around the city. They built an amphitheater beneath what is now the Guildhall. And in that amphitheater, they didn't just watch gladiators fight. They watched people die for entertainment. Prisoners, criminals, slaves, executed publicly while crowds cheered. This was Roman justice. This was Roman civilization. Then around 410 AD, Rome collapsed under its own weight. Emperor Honorius sent a simple message to Britain: "You're on your own." The legions left. And without Rome, Londinium didn't slowly decline. It collapsed overnight. A city of 50,000 people became a ghost town within a generation. The grand buildings rotted. The mosaic floors disappeared under weeds. The walls that were built to protect the city just stood there, empty, holding nothing but shadows. Rome left, but the darkness stayed. For 2 centuries after Rome, the Saxons rebuilt something new. A trading town called Londonwick, roughly where Covent Garden stands today. By the early 700s, it was thriving. 8,000 people, goods flowing in from across Europe. Then from the north, from the sea, came something that would terrorize London for the next 100 years. The Vikings didn't just raid coastal villages. They came up the Thames in force. Longships full of warriors who had already burned half of Europe. In 842, they sacked Londonwick completely. Burned it, slaughtered its people, took everything of value. London barely recovered when in 851, they came back and did it again. This wasn't war with rules and negotiations. This was systematic terror, repeated destruction, a city living in constant fear of the horizon. King Alfred the Great finally had enough. He retook London in 886 and made a decision that shows just how desperate things had become. He abandoned the entire Saxon settlement and moved everyone back inside the old Roman walls, because those ancient stone walls were the only thing strong enough to stop what was coming. He repaired the walls, dug new defensive ditches, turned London into a fortress. And the defeated Vikings? Archaeological digs around London have uncovered mass graves of headless Viking warriors. Some historians believe these were enemy soldiers executed after capture, their heads removed as both punishment and warning. Alfred understood one thing clearly: in this era, the only message your enemies respected was written in blood. London survived the Vikings, but it learned something dangerous: that violence works. Christmas Day, 1066. Westminster Abbey. William, Duke of Normandy, is crowned King of England. It sounds ceremonial, almost peaceful. It wasn't. William had just fought his way across England, leaving a trail of burned villages and massacred communities. The harrying of the North alone, his campaign to crush Saxon resistance, killed an estimated 100,000 people through violence and deliberate starvation. He didn't just conquer England. He destroyed parts of it completely. London knew what William was capable of. And William knew London didn't fully trust him, so he built the Tower of London. Not as a palace, not as a symbol of grandeur, as a warning. That massive stone keep, 90 feet high, walls 12 feet thick, was positioned deliberately at the edge of the city, visible from everywhere, impossible to ignore. Every morning Londoners woke up and saw it on their skyline. The message was clear. I am here, I am watching. Do not test me. The tower became the center of English darkness for the next 500 years. Prisoners arrived by river through the Traitor's Gate, many of them never leaving. Torture happened in its dungeons, the rack, the scavenger's daughter. Instruments designed not just to punish, but to break a human being completely before they died. Two young princes, Edward and Richard, the sons of Edward IV, disappeared inside the tower in 1483 and were never seen again. Historians still argue about what happened. The bones of two children were found buried beneath a staircase centuries later. Medieval London's justice was built on public suffering. Hanging, drawing, and quartering, where a person was hanged, cut down while still alive, disemboweled, and then cut into 4 pieces, was considered a normal punishment for treason. These executions weren't hidden. They were performed publicly, sometimes at Tyburn, sometimes at the Tower Hill, always with crowds watching. London Bridge displayed the heads of traitors on spikes for decades at a time. Visitors arriving by river were greeted by rotting human heads. Power in medieval London had one language: public suffering. Ships arrive at London's docks from the continent. They're carrying cargo. They're also carrying rats. On those rats, fleas. In those fleas, Yersinia pestis, one of the deadliest bacteria in human history. Within weeks, people in London start dying. First a swelling in the armpit or groin, hard and painful, the size of an egg. Then black patches appearing on the skin. Then fever, vomiting, internal bleeding. Then death. Usually within 3 to 5 days of the first symptoms. At the peak of the outbreak, London was losing hundreds of people per day. The healthy fled if they could. Doctors, such as they were, wore long robes, gloves, and those terrifying beak masks stuffed with herbs and spices, believing bad air was the cause. They understood nothing. They could do nothing. People were dying so fast that normal burial became impossible. Mass graves were dug in fields outside the city walls. Bodies were thrown in, layer upon layer, lime poured over them. One burial site discovered during construction work at Smithfield in recent years contained hundreds of plague victims stacked together, silent witnesses to those catastrophic months. By the time the Black Death burned itself out, somewhere between a third and half of London's entire population was dead. Streets that had been busy and crowded were suddenly silent. Entire families wiped out in days. Houses full of bodies with nobody left to report it. Survivors wandered through a city that looked normal but felt completely hollow. They looted their dead neighbors' homes. They took on multiple jobs because there was suddenly nobody else to do them. The psychological horror of watching everyone around you die with no explanation, no cure, no hope. That kind of trauma doesn't disappear when the dying stops. The plague left. The trauma didn't. The plague returns to London. Not the Black Death exactly, but close enough. The city has grown enormously since the 14th century. It's now a cramped, overcrowded metropolis of nearly 400,000 people packed into timber buildings on narrow streets. Perfect conditions for disease to spread, and spread it does. At the peak of the 1665 outbreak, 7,000 Londoners are dying every week. Red crosses are painted on the doors of infected houses with the words "Lord have mercy upon us" written beneath them. Watchmen are posted outside to make sure nobody enters or leaves, trapping the healthy inside with the dying. Plague doctors walk the streets in their beak masks, carrying wooden canes to touch patients without getting close. Carts roll through at night collecting bodies. The wealthy escaped to the countryside and waited it out. The poor had nowhere to go. By the end, roughly 100,000 people were dead, a quarter of London's population, gone. Then on September 2nd, 1666, a fire starts in a bakery on Pudding Lane. It's been a long, hot, dry summer. Strong winds are blowing. The fire moves faster than anyone thought possible through London's timber buildings and thatched roofs. For 4 days the city burns. 85% of everything within the walls is destroyed. 13,000 houses gone, 87 churches, the old St. Paul's Cathedral. 100,000 people left homeless overnight. But here's the dark part that gets buried in the official history. London needed someone to blame. Catholics were accused of deliberately starting the fire as part of a French and papal conspiracy. A man named Robert Hubert confessed to starting it, despite the fact that he hadn't even arrived in England when the fire began. He was hanged anyway. The confession didn't need to be true. The city needed a scapegoat more than it needed the truth. London had survived plague and fire. But now a different kind of darkness was coming, one with a human face. Victorian London, the heart of the richest empire the world had ever seen. Queen Victoria on the throne, the British flag flying across a quarter of the globe. And in the shadow of all that wealth and power, some of the most horrific human suffering in the city's history. The population explosion of the 19th century crammed millions of people into London with nowhere to put them. The East End slums were beyond description. Entire families, 8, 10, 12 people, living in single rooms. Children working 16-hour days in factories, down coal mines, up chimneys. The Thames was an open sewer. The streets were thick with horse manure, coal smoke, and the smell of death. Cholera outbreaks in the 1830s and 1840s killed tens of thousands. Entire neighborhoods were wiped out before anyone understood how the disease spread. When a doctor named John Snow finally proved in 1854 that cholera came from contaminated water and not bad air, the medical establishment fought him. The truth was inconvenient. By 1858, the Thames had become so polluted, so thick with human waste, that the smell became unbearable. Parliament itself had to shut down that summer because the stench from the river made it impossible to work. They called it the Great Stink. The river that had been London's lifeblood for 2,000 years had become a death trap. Public hangings at Newgate Prison drew massive crowds, tens of thousands of people showing up to watch a person die. Children climbed on rooftops for a better view. Street vendors sold food. It was entertainment. The last public hanging in England happened in 1868, and the crowd was so large it caused a crush that injured dozens of people. Then 1888, Whitechapel, East End. 5 women, Mary Ann Nichols, Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride, Catherine Eddowes, Mary Jane Kelly, are murdered in the space of a few months. The killer removes organs with surgical precision. He writes taunting letters to the police. He is never caught. Jack the Ripper becomes the most infamous criminal in London's history, not just because of the murders, but because of what they revealed. The police were incompetent. The establishment didn't care deeply about poor women dying in the East End, and some historians have argued with quiet persistence that the reason the killer was never found was not incompetence, but protection. That someone with power and connections committed those murders. That London's dark establishment closed ranks around one of its own. It has never been proven. It has never been disproven. Victorian London built an empire. It just buried the cost under the cobblestones, September 7th, 1940, late afternoon. London's air raid sirens begin to scream. 348 German bombers, escorted by 617 fighter planes, cross the English Channel and head directly for London. For the next 57 consecutive nights, German bombs fall on this city. Every single night, entire neighborhoods are leveled, hospitals hit, schools hit, churches hit, ordinary streets reduced to rubble and ash by morning. Hundreds of thousands of Londoners took shelter in the underground stations, Aldwych, Bethnal Green, Elephant, and Castle. They slept on platforms, on the tracks, in tunnels. It felt safer down there. But on March 3, 1943, at Bethnal Green Station, a woman fell on the steps during an air raid warning. In the darkness, in the panic, people behind her fell too. Within seconds, 173 people were crushed to death, the single deadliest civilian incident of the entire war in Britain. Not a bomb. A staircase. A moment of panic. The government suppressed the story for years. They didn't want the public to know. Above ground, London bled and bled. But something else happened too, that nobody talks about much. Looting. Bomb sites were stripped by London's own residents. Shops were broken into during raids. Bodies were robbed before they were cold. The Blitz mythology says London stood together, defiant and dignified. The reality is messier, darker, more human. Some people were heroic. Some people weren't. By the end of the war, 1 million buildings in London were damaged or destroyed. The empire that had made London the center of the world was finished. India independent in 1947, colonies breaking away one by one. And at home, rationing continued into the 1950s. London was broke, exhausted and traumatized in ways it didn't have the language to describe. Then in December 1952, a weather system settled over London and trapped the coal smoke from millions of chimneys close to the ground. For 5 days, the city was wrapped in a thick, toxic, yellow-black fog so dense that people couldn't see their own hands in front of their faces. Buses stopped running. The fog seeped into homes, into lungs. 12,000 people died. The government's initial response was to deny the scale of the disaster, to delay action, to protect the coal industry. The Clean Air Act didn't come until 1956, 4 years after 12,000 people choked to death in their own city. Even in the 20th century, London couldn't escape its darkest instinct, suffering on an industrial scale. Modern London, 9 million people. One of the wealthiest, most powerful cities on the planet. And still, the darkness finds a way. April 1981, Brixton, South London. Years of poverty, unemployment, and aggressive policing of black communities explode into 3 days of riots. Buildings burn, hundreds are injured. The Scarman report that followed admitted what the community had been saying for years. The police were discriminatory. The government had ignored the poverty deliberately. Nothing changed fast enough. The riots came back in 1985. They came back again in 2011, this time spreading across the whole city and beyond. July 7, 2005. 4 suicide bombers detonate explosives on 3 underground trains and a bus during the morning rush hour. 52 people killed. Hundreds injured. The city that had survived the Blitz, the IRA, centuries of violence, stopped completely. For a day, London was silent with shock. June 14, 2017. Grenfell Tower, North Kensington. A fire breaks out in a 24-story residential block in the early hours of the morning. The building had recently been refurbished with cladding that turned out to be dangerously flammable. Residents had been warning about fire safety for years. Written warnings. Formal complaints, ignored. 72 people died. Many of them burned alive or suffocated in their homes because the official advice was to stay in their flats and wait. Investigations revealed that cost-cutting decisions, ignored warnings, and institutional indifference to the lives of poor residents had made the disaster not just possible, but inevitable. The same story London has told for 2,000 years, the powerful protecting themselves, the vulnerable paying the price. Today, London remains one of the most unequal cities in the developed world. Billionaires own entire streets in Mayfair and Kensington. 2 miles away, people sleep on the pavement outside those same streets. The knife crime epidemic has taken hundreds of young lives, mostly young men from the city's poorest communities, mostly ignored until it becomes impossible to ignore. 2,000 years on, and London is still divided by exactly the same fault lines: power, poverty, and the question of whose suffering matters. Every city has a dark side. London's is just older, deeper, and better hidden. The Tower of London still stands. The Thames still flows. Tourists photograph the changing of the guard and eat fish and chips and buy postcards with red telephone boxes on them. And all of that is real. But underneath it, underneath the pageantry and the history and the pride, there are layers of ash and bone and suffering that London has never fully faced. What makes London extraordinary isn't the palaces. It isn't the empire. It isn't even the resilience, though the resilience is real. What makes London extraordinary is that it has survived every darkness it created and every darkness visited upon it, and it keeps going. Messy, unequal, complicated, contradictory, and still standing after 2,000 years of trying to destroy itself. That's the real history of London. And now you know it.